I saw them first. 3 men standing on my property, no permission, no warning. A red dot from a laser rangefinder flicked across my fence like it wasn't even there. I knew what they were up to. Boundary checks for Serenity Ridge Phase 4, they said. But my fence hadn't moved in 60 years. Boundary verification, they muttered. That's when it hit me this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They were here to take something. I didn't ask questions. I walked to the gate,
sir.
slow, steady, and then I told them the only thing I knew for sure. This land isn't for sale. What happened next? They weren't ready for that. It didn't take long for the real face of the Serenity Ridge HOA to show up. A few days after the surveyors, a black SUV pulled up the driveway. The man who stepped out had polished shoes and a smile too clean for these dirt roads. His shirt crisp like he thought a handshake could buy him land. "Mr. Marston," he asked, extending his hand. "Carter Mills Horizon Vista Developments. We're working with the HOA on the new Serenity Ridge expansion." I didn't shake his hand. Depends who's asking. He didn't flinch. He pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and opened it, sliding a glossy map across the porch table. My land was right there. Green fields, pastures, roads, cul-de-sacs, all of it. "We're prepared to offer you well above market value for your land," he said. "Clean exit. No hassle." I pushed the folder back toward him. "My land's not for sale." That smile didn't waver. But I saw it, the tiny crack in his mask, the way his eyes flickered just a bit too fast when I refused. He wasn't used to hearing no, but the HOA, they were used to taking. And that's when I knew this wasn't about a deal. This was about them taking what they'd already decided was theirs. And I wasn't going to let that happen. 2 days after the opportunity visit, I found the first notice in my mailbox. It wasn't an official letter, no county seal, no legal jargon, just a poorly printed sheet that looked like it came straight from a photocopier. "Boundary discrepancies, failure to comply with Serenity Ridge's guidelines," it said. I tossed it aside without much thought, but I knew what it meant. They were laying the groundwork, testing the waters. Then came the second, and the third. Letters started showing up like clockwork, fines for improper livestock containment violations for visual harmony and non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetics. If there was a single thing they could pick apart, they did. But here's the kicker, all of it was nonsense. My fence had been standing for decades. My cattle had never strayed beyond the gates. The land was mine, my father's, my grandfather's, and so on. But none of that mattered to them. The HOA wasn't playing by the rules. They were making them. The next morning I heard something strange, a low mechanical hum that wasn't the wind or my old ranch truck. I stepped out onto the porch and saw them. 3 men dressed too neatly for a place like this, with clipboards and laser rangefinders. One raised his device, and I knew what was happening. They were measuring the land. My land. Boundary verification for Serenity Ridge. One of them called over, as if they had the right. I walked up to the fence, my boots grinding into the dirt, and leaned on the gate. "What boundary?" I asked, voice calm, steady. The tallest one glanced at me, then back to his clipboard. "Phase 4 expansion," he muttered, tapping his pen. "Standard procedure, no apology. No, we're sorry to intrude, just business." They thought they were entitled to my property like it was a forgotten scrap of land to be sold off to the highest bidder. The real damage came a few days later. I was in the barn, fixing a broken hinge on a gate when I saw it. A flash of orange. A surveyor's flag stuck into the earth, planted right at the edge of my gravel driveway, exactly where the line for Serenity Ridge Phase 4 was supposed to be. I walked up, my jaw tightening with every step. A flag. On my land, the nerve of it. They hadn't even had the decency to ask. By the time I reached it, a cold anger had settled in my gut. I grabbed the flag, yanking it out of the ground, and I could feel the weight of what it meant. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. It was a declaration, and I wasn't going to let it stand. I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle, and then I turned to my fence. I started walking the line, hand brushing against the cedar posts that had stood for generations. The survey crew wasn't just crossing boundaries, they were trying to erase them. I wasn't going to let that happen. That night, the first official complaint came in the form of a letter delivered by the county sheriff. It was an accusation of obstructing development, more paperwork, trying to pressure me into submission, and just like that, the HOA had brought in the law. The sheriff's deputy, a quiet man with a sharp look in his eyes, handed me the papers. He seemed uncomfortable, like he didn't quite believe the story he was carrying, but his hands were tied. "I've got to follow the orders," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "But if you need anything..." I didn't need his sympathy. I didn't need anything from him. What I needed was for them to understand that this land wasn't for sale. It wasn't some zoning issue. It wasn't a bureaucratic problem. But the sheriff's presence, his polite, sterile way of enforcing their demands, made it clear this was no longer just about trespassing. This was a full-on legal assault. And then just as I was about to close the door, a thought hit me. They weren't just sending letters. They were sending everyone. And they weren't going to stop until they broke me. By the time the next wave hit, I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't just sit back and let them keep pushing me. That morning, a sleek black SUV rolled up to my gate with tinted windows and a set of shiny wheels. Out stepped a woman in a sharp suit, Darlene Hargrove, the president of the HOA. She had that cold smile, the kind that told you everything you needed to know about a person who'd never known hard work. She didn't come to negotiate. She came to demand. "Mr. Marston," she said, walking up to the gate, like she owned the whole damn property. "We're here to address your non-cooperation with Serenity Ridge's development plan." "Non-cooperation?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I got an envelope telling me to step aside. If that's your idea of informing me, you're doing a lousy job." She didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted into her negotiation mode, that patronizing tone of someone used to having everything their way. "You're obstructing progress," she said. "Phase 4 needs your land. This is about community integration." "Community integration?" I spat, stepping forward. "That's a fancy way of saying you want to take it." Behind her, the so-called community safety officer stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "This gate obstructs emergency access." I laughed. "This gate's been here longer than your subdivision. If it wasn't a problem for 30 years, it isn't one now." Darlene's smile faded just a fraction, but she quickly recovered. "We can resolve this amicably, Mr. Marston, but you need to understand that the HOA has the authority to petition for condemnation if this property poses a threat to the surrounding community." Condemnation, that's when I knew they were done pretending. They weren't asking for permission, they were taking. And they didn't care about my land, my legacy. They cared about their bottom line. I leaned in, my voice low and steady. "This isn't your community, and it's not your land. Your progress stops at my fence." It was official now. No more playing nice. They'd crossed the line, and I was done talking. The tension in the air was thick, but I knew something had to give. The HOA's lies had stacked up too high, and it was time for them to face the truth. I didn't go looking for a fight, but they made it clear they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, so I brought it to them. The day the court date was set, Darlene Grove, Carter, Mills, and the rest of the HOA were all there, sitting smugly on the other side of the courtroom. They thought their paper trail would be enough to bury me, but I had more than just a counterclaim. I had proof. The judge, a sharp-eyed man with a deep frown, called the proceedings to order. "Mr. Marston," he said, adjusting his glasses, "you're representing yourself." I nodded. The courtroom murmured, but I didn't care. I wasn't here to impress anyone. I was here to make sure my land stayed mine. Darlene crossed her arms, her lips tight with irritation, but she didn't say a word. Her lawyer, Stanley Polk, strutted up with his thick binder of documents, prepared to argue that my land didn't belong to me anymore. They thought they had me cornered. They thought wrong. "I'd like to submit evidence to the court," I said, standing up, my voice carrying across the room. I handed the judge a thick manila folder. Inside, the laminated map from the survey stakes. The same map they'd filed with the county, showing their Phase 4 development plans right across my land. Polk laughed lightly, but it was a nervous chuckle. "Anyone can print a map. That proves nothing." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You're right, but this does." I clicked a button on the projector. The first video filled the courtroom screens. It showed two men creeping across my land in the dead of night. One was planting a survey stake, the other moving with precision, trying to cover his tracks. But they weren't prepared for the second camera. The room was dead silent as I played the next video, my floodlight flashing across the figures, catching them in the act. And then, the glowing footprints. The UV tracer powder illuminated their every step as clear as day. I watched Polk's face drain of color, and Darlene's hands began to tremble. Polk stammered for a response, but there was nothing he could say. I dropped more evidence onto the table, a still frame from the security footage showing one of the trespassers planting a survey marker at the edge of my land, clearly labeled Serenity Ridge Phase 4 Boundary. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cold, "this isn't just trespassing. This is fraud. They've been selling land that doesn't belong to them, and they've been using the county's paperwork to cover their tracks." The judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Polk, your clients have clearly entered the Marston property without authorization. You're claiming boundary discrepancies, but the evidence shows otherwise. This is the map they've submitted to the county, and this," he gestured to the video footage, "proves they've been tampering with the boundaries." Polk turned pale. His earlier arrogance was gone. Darlene, however, stood as stiff as a board, her mouth a thin line. Before anyone could speak, the courtroom door opened with a soft click. A man in a charcoal suit stepped inside, holding a silver portfolio under his arm. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, walking towards the judge. "My name is Ethan Calder, and I represent Horizon Vista Land Development." Darlene's face drained of all color. I saw the panic flicker in her eyes before she could hide it. Calder addressed the court. "We've received anonymous evidence this week showing that Serenity Ridge has been selling development rights on land it does not own. We intend to withdraw all contracts related to Phase 4, and we are exploring legal actions against Serenity Ridge for misrepresentation." The room was silent for a long moment. The weight of Calder's words was like a punch to the gut. Serenity Ridge was finished. The judge didn't even flinch. He looked at Darlene and the HOA representatives, shaking his head. "This case is no longer about boundary disputes. This is about fraud, trespassing, and unauthorized land dealings." With that, he banged his gavel. "Effective immediately, Serenity Ridge HOA is barred from entering or claiming oversight of the Marston parcel. All filings related to Phase 4 are nullified. Any further interference will be met with both civil and criminal consequences." The room erupted into murmurs, but I didn't need to say a word. The victory was clear, written in the legal language that would stop Serenity Ridge dead in its tracks. For the first time in months, I felt the weight on my chest lift. I had won. And the HOA. They were about to face the consequences of thinking they could erase me from the land. The days that followed the court ruling felt strange. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest lifted, and I could finally breathe easy. The battle had been long and hard, but as I stepped out of the courthouse, I noticed something I hadn't expected. The town was changing. Neighbors who had avoided my gaze for years now slowed their trucks as they passed by my place. They didn't stop, but they didn't need to. A nod, a wave, maybe a brief tip of the hat, it was enough. Word had spread. The fight for my land wasn't just my fight. It was a message to everyone who'd ever been pushed aside, ignored, or told to just give up. Even the people I barely knew gave me a quiet respect. A sense of solidarity passed between us, and it felt good. Not the kind of good that comes from victory, but the kind that comes from knowing that in the end, people see what you stand for. Some people never say a word, but their eyes tell you everything. It wasn't just the land I had protected. It was the spirit of standing your ground, of holding on when everyone else tells you to let go. That's what the community saw, and it was enough to make everything feel right again. The next few days brought more letters, and these ones had the weight of finality to them. The county's stamp was on them. Big, bold letters. Boundary affirmed. Serenity Ridge gone. The HOA's claim to my land void. The Phase 4 development project officially canceled. And every legal document, every contract they had drawn up had been nullified. I couldn't help but smile when I saw it, not in arrogance but in relief. They'd tried everything, intimidation, paperwork, pressure, but in the end, they couldn't erase what was mine. The sheriff came by to officially notify me of the investigation the county had opened into the HOA. Fraud, misrepresentation, criminal trespass, the charges were stacking up. Darlene had already disappeared. Word was she'd hired her own lawyer the day Horizon Vista backed out. A few of the board members had flipped, offering up evidence in exchange for their own safety. It was the unraveling I had hoped for. But more than that, it felt like the land itself had spoken. No matter how they tried to change the map, the soil remembered. The court had spoken. The county had spoken. And my land stood firm, untouched. A week later, the changes continued, but this time, they weren't about me. Serenity Ridge was falling apart. The workers from the county rolled into the entrance and took down the Phase 4 sign, leaving the Serenity Ridge part intact. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory every time I saw it. The weight of their defeat was written on the face of that sign. They had overstretched, tried to take something that wasn't theirs, and now they were left with nothing. Darlene Hargrove was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it she was keeping a low profile after the lawsuit was filed. The last I heard, she had hired one of the biggest law firms in town to defend her, clearly trying to keep the truth from coming to light. But she was already a ghost, and her ghost was haunting the HOA now. The damage was done. I'd been the one to stand up, but the others were watching. Watching closely. The county didn't just affirm my boundaries, they made sure the HOA knew that no amount of paperwork could overwrite the truth. They had no claim, and they were going to pay for their lies. It didn't matter that I'd won. What mattered was that everyone else saw it too. They saw how the little guy could stand up and beat the big guys. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what it meant to take on something as powerful as the HOA and win. The evening air was still the sun, just beginning to dip behind the hills as I rode along the western fence line. I stopped at the spot where the last survey marker had been planted, the one that had started it all. The ground was soft, undisturbed now, but it wasn't just soil, it was history. My father's history, my grandfather's. I looked out across the land. The cattle were grazing in the distance, the wind brushing against the cedar trees. Everything felt just as it should. I didn't need the victory to feel complete. The land was mine. It had always been mine, and nothing, not even the HOA, could take that away from me. The sun sank lower, the golden light bathing the pasture. I stood there for a while just watching, and in that moment I knew it wasn't just the battle that mattered. It was the land, the memories, the generations that had fought before me. The fight was over, and I had held the line. As I turned my horse back toward the house, I could see the first stars flickering in the sky, shining over a place that had always been home. The world had kept spinning, but, for me, everything had changed. I smiled quietly to myself. They'd tried to take my land, but they didn't count on one thing. This land doesn't forget, and neither do I.